Alright, so my name is William Kranich. This is my assistant Jack Miller, and today we're going to be teaching you how to play the wonderful game of chess. This guy right here is the pawn, and if you can learn how the pawn moves, you can pretty much learn how any chess piece moves in the game, because although it being the weakest piece and the most numerous piece, it is also kind of the most complicated piece in how it moves. So on its first turn, when it's sitting on the 2 line right here, it can move 2 spaces on its first turn. However, every turn after this, it can only move 1. So it also has the option to singularly just move 1 space ahead. However, where it gets extra tricky, and a lot of people get confused with this, is the pawn can only attack sideways. So if there was a pawn here and a pawn here, this pawn can only take this pawn, but can't go forward to take this pawn. Every other piece in the game, its movement is the same as its attacks. So for every other piece in the game, for example, the rook can move across, and it can take pieces in the same directions in which it can move. However, the pawn can only take across and only can move forward. Alright, for the next piece I'm going to describe is the rook. Now, the rook can move infinitely in any direction other than across. So it can't do this, but it can move infinitely in this direction, it can move infinitely in this direction, it can go all the way over here, and it can also take any piece that's kind of in its way with 1 turn. Now, when pieces take other pieces, it's simply just, it's not like checkers where it goes over it and takes it. It's simply, it just takes its place and you take it up like such. And then after that, it can move like this, and then that would be a turn. And if it moved again, that would be a turn. And that's pretty much how you would have the rook move. Now the next piece I'm going to describe is the knight. And the knight is interesting because it moves in any direction in an L shape. So this kind of makes it second on the list for most complicated piece and how it moves right below the pawn, but it can move 1, 2, and then turns on 3, and can turn on 3 in either direction, or it can move 1, 2, and turn on 3 in either direction. Now, interestingly enough, the knight is also the only piece in the game that is capable of jumping over other pieces. It doesn't take the piece when it jumps over it, it just simply hops over it. So if there was this guy here, he could just go right over it. He doesn't take it, but he just jumps over it. However, if there was a pawn here, the knight could jump over this piece and take this piece, and you'd simply have that piece out.
Boom. Alright, so the next piece we're going to talk about is called the bishop, which is this piece right here. The bishop is a very simple piece in the way that it moves and the way that it takes other pieces, in that it simply moves diagonally in whatever amount of spaces it wants to move, so it's unlimited. The bishop takes pieces in the same way that it moves, so if it was sitting here, it would be able to just diagonally move and take this pawn. In every game you have 2 bishops, same with knight and rook, but the bishop is a little bit more interesting in that each bishop is bound to its own color. So one bishop would start on white, one bishop would start on black, and if you were to lose the black or white bishop, you would only have the bishop influence on the one color, since it can't change spaces, it can only move diagonally. Alright, so the next piece we're going to talk about is the queen, right here. The queen is easily the most powerful and versatile piece in the game. It can move forward or diagonally in any direction, and it can capture pieces in that sort of movement. So he could move forward, capture this pawn, or she could move diagonally, capture this pawn. The queen is one of the only pieces in the game that you only have 1 of, so if you lose it, you'll be at a significant disadvantage. Yeah, that's pretty much it. The queen is just a very powerful piece that you should protect and utilize only when you need to. Boom.
Alright. This is the king. It is undoubtedly the most important piece on the board. Throughout the entire game, both sides are simply just trying to take the other side's king. The king is capable of moving in any direction that isn't already occupied by another piece. For example, the king can move here, 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 or here in this circumstance. If this pawn was here, it could also move here. And vice versa for the pawns that are here and here. Now, if the king is put into jeopardy, so for example, if this pawn were to move here, it's called check. And what this means is that you can't move any of your other pieces until your king is no longer in jeopardy. So, that would mean that you would either have to move the king out of the way, or you would have to take this piece with either the king or a different piece instead. Whereas if something else happens, there's also another option. If, per se, this bishop were to move here and put the king into check, you also have another option to move a piece in front of the king so that the next turn this bishop isn't capable of taking the king. The point being that you can't move in such a way that the king will be captured immediately in the next turn. The only way to truly take the king is if you put them in a situation where, for example, the king was here and you happen to have the other queen here. Now, there's no way for the king to move out of check, and in the next turn it's inevitable that this queen will be able to take the king, and there's nothing that can take the queen, and thus this would mean black would win. Now I'm going to discuss point values and how much each piece is worth. This will be important for the next section, which is a strategy called trading, and where you decide whether or not it's a good decision to actually take another piece. Here I have all of the different types of chess pieces aligned from most valuable to least valuable. The pawn, being the least valuable piece on the board, is only worth about 1 point. Now, keep in mind this whole point value system is kind of different depending on who you ask. I'm just giving you what I always played with as my point value. Some people may think that the point values are different, and there's no point in the game where having more points than somebody else automatically means you win. It's just a system for deciding whether or not it's worth it to trade, for example, a knight for a bishop or something like that. So, starting with the pawn, as I just stated, it is worth 1 point. The knight, on my point value scale, is worth 3. The bishop, on my point value scale, is also worth 3. The rook is, on my point value scale, worth 5. Queen being 9, and I was always taught that the king is entirely priceless. There's no value you can put on the king, it's the most important piece in the game. Now, I understand my assistant, Jack Miller, has a different way of assigning these point values and how much each piece is worth. Would you want to go over that?
Yeah, of course. So most of the point values are, as I would assign them, are the same as Will's. The king's priceless, of course. You know, you can't assign a point value to a piece that is necessary for you to even be in the game in the first place. Pawn's still 1. Queen is 11. Where things get a little bit tricky is that I assign each of the minor pieces, the bishop and the knight, as 4, whereas the rook is considered 5.
So it's important to keep in mind that all of these point values, like I stated before, are simply something subjective that you kind of assign yourself to them, but it is very important that if you are ever going to win a game, that the pawn is the least valuable, the knight comes after that, the bishop comes after that, then, well, in mine these are equally valued. In Jack Miller, did you?
Yeah. The knight and the bishop are kind of up to the discrepancy of the person playing. You know, some people, I personally value knights over bishops. Some people value bishops over knights, but generally they're worth the same amount of points. So, you'd want to. They should be equal in their point values. It's just that they have they each have their own situations that they're better at, and yeah.
And then of course you'd have the rook that comes after that, the queen, and the king. You generally should have it so that the lowest is here, and then the point values tend to go up in this direction with the pieces. So that's point values. Now we're going to move on to trading. Now next we're going to discuss something that's very common in chess, known as trading. A lot of the times in chess, at least for beginners, you want to think about kind of when you're going into a trade, which piece is you're trading out for other pieces. In more advanced levels of chess, sometimes they'll do a bad trade just so that their pieces are aligned in a certain way, so that they can do something in the future, but that's much more complicated, much more advanced. It's more advanced than me and Jack Miller here. Normally me and Jack Miller, when we're playing, we'll just do trades that end up having a higher value of pieces or a higher value of points total in the end. And that's where the points really come into play, is deciding whether or not you came on top on a trade in your own personal opinion kind of thing. So in this situation, we have Jack Miller playing as black and me as playing as white. And as you can see here, if it was Jack Miller's turn, he's capable of taking my pawn, but then it would become my turn. And in that turn, I'd be capable of taking his pawn with my pawn. And then after that, it continues to go along, where we keep taking pieces back and forth. Now, the thing you gotta kind of have to do is look ahead and figure out who's gonna end up with the most pieces in the end and the highest point value in the end. So, for everybody watching right now, we're gonna give you a minute to just kind of look at the board and see if you can figure out who's gonna come out on top in this situation if it's Jack Miller's turn, and whether or not Jack Miller should initiate this trade that'll result in us taking pieces back and forth, and who's going to end up with the highest value point value piece, or highest point value pieces in the end. So now that we're back, hopefully you've decided who would come out on top. Jack Miller, feel free to make your turn that you would make in this kind of situation.
Okay.
And we'll see if it's a good trade or not. So he would do that. I would then end up taking his pawn. He would take my pawn. I would take his pawn with my bishop, and he takes his bishop with my knight. And that's the end of the trade, because there's no way I can take his knight with anything. Of course, it would be my turn, so I could move something like this, but of course Jack Miller could then move away, and that would be the end of that. So that would be the end of the trade. Now, if you look, Jack Miller has taken 2 of my pawns. I've taken 2 of his pawns, but he's also taken this bishop. Now, the thing here is, of course, each of these pawns are worth 1, so this is all equal, and then the bishop is worth 3. So someone looking at, or in my opinion, is worth 3. So looking into this game, I think I'm losing by 3. Jack Miller, you would say I was losing by
4, probably.
4?
But
Okay. So it's all dependent, but pretty much to get that back, I would end up having to take a knight or something among those lines to try and even it out without him taking any of my pieces. But at this point in the game, it's obvious that now Jack Miller is ahead because of that trade, and it was a trade that I didn't want to go into. However, Jack Miller got his advantage, so of course he wanted to initiate the trade.
Alright, so we'd also like to demonstrate the importance of the center of the board and how many pieces thrive in the center over in the sides of the board. So if you look, the easiest piece to demonstrate this with is the knight, whereas the knight in the center of the board has a huge circle of influence of pieces, of spaces that it can move. Since it can move in any direction, different L shapes, it can move there, 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 which is huge in terms of influence and where your enemy can move. Whereas this knight over here, since it's not in the middle of the board and there's pretty much no board existent on this half of the knight's spectrum, it can only move there, there, and back to where it started, which isn't very influential when it can only threaten 2 spots on the board, whereas this knight can threaten like 8. Same thing goes for the pawn too. Pawns in the middle of the board granted they can only occupy 2 spaces. However, pawns are low piece values, and especially they'll usually be the first pieces to go in an exchange. So you really want them to be at the center of the fight and in the center of the board, so that you can have the most influence out of each pawn.
So the next thing I want to go over is a bunch of little different like quirks of chess that you should probably know. For example, the one I'm showing you right now is called en passant. So remember how pawns were capable of moving forward 2 spaces? Well, the kind of way this works is the pawn goes forward once, and it's capable of taking another turn and going forward again. So this means that after it moves forward its 2 pieces, once it's black's turn, if white does this, and if it has a piece like a pawn here, it can go like that and actually take the pawn after it's moved forward 2 pieces. Because the idea here is that there was a point in time during like the battle or what have you that the pawn was sitting here, so that this piece could have taken it while it was doing that. And so that pretty much means that as it moves up here, this can just move there and take it. It's kind of complex. It's a little weird. It's kind of like one of those things that doesn't really happen too often in chess, but it's an interesting thing to keep in mind because it's like somebody can pull that on you, especially if they got their pawns very aggressively moved towards your side of the board. Next, I'm going to tell you about the other quirk of chess, which is castling, and that's also that's a much more used quirk of chess. That's a very good defensive strategy, especially for beginners. Okay, so next we have castling. Castling is very interesting and it's a really good strategy. So if on either side you have moved your pieces so that there's no pieces between the king and the rook, then what the king is capable of doing is moving 2 pieces to the right towards the rook, and then the rook is capable of jumping over him and being right here. However, this can't happen if your rook has already moved or if your king has moved out of the way, for example, in this direction. There's king-side castling and queen-side castling. This is a king-side castle because it's on the king's side of the board. However, there's something called, almost dropped the king there, king-side castling, which is mostly the same, but it's a little bit different. See, the king still can only move 2 pieces over, but the rook, when it castles, ends up here, which is really kind of interesting because it kind of it's a castle that's kind of left open, but it's still a castle. So, for example, if in a situation you might want to use this is if this pawn was taken, so that regardless if you castled on king side, that you would end up in a situation where there's still a hole in the castle. Then you can possibly go and do a castle on the other side, and you can also just fill in the castle in another 2 turns by doing something like that if you really wanted to. But that's castling, and it's very advantageous because you can actually do it. Although I've moved out pieces on both sides, you can do it simply just by moving out the pieces on one side and then castling to that one side. So that pretty much just means all you need to do would be to move this pawn. You would need to only move this pawn forward, this guy here, this over here, this actually would go here, and then you could castle and it could be done the first 3 or 4 turns. And then you also have a bunch of pieces that you've moved out onto the board that you can then be using. So that's castling, very good for beginning players, and it's also used a lot by other players too, just to make sure your king is protected.